My name is Leonard Kozianski. I'm an artist. This is my studio. Welcome to my studio. I'd like to talk to you about style. And what is a style? We hear a lot of talk about artists' style, and, I like that artist's style, or as an artist, I have to develop my own style. Well, what is that? And what does it mean? And how do we do that if we want to develop a style? Well, let's look at some examples of styles throughout history and see if we can't figure out how it's done and why it's done. And of course, if we're going to look at style and examine it throughout history, we have to go back in time, way back, to the ancient Greeks. Of course, it always begins with the ancient Greeks, right? Yes. Okay, so here we are. This sculpture is called the Medici Venus, and it's in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. It was carved out of marble in the 1st century BC in ancient Greece. It represents Venus, the goddess of beauty. And it's done in a very might say, realistic style, almost an idealized erotic style. It lets us see that the ancient artists, the Greeks and Romans, looked at the world as an interesting place, as a beautiful place, as a sensual place to be enjoyed, that we were to enjoy the sensual beauty of the world around us. And we were to appreciate that as part of our life. However, that style, that more realistic, more erotic style, changed significantly during the Middle Ages. And here we see an example from around 900 AD. And this is an illumination, an illustration from the Book of Kells. And this is a picture of Christ enthroned. And so this is early Christian imagery. Actually, it's middle-aged Christian imagery. And notice how unworldly it is, how unerotic it is. It's very transcendent, very symbolic, because the artists of the early Christian and medieval eras saw the world as a place of chaos and temptation, an evil place where we were to prove our worthiness of heaven by avoiding temptation, by being good, and when we died, we would go to heaven and be with Christ enthroned in that symbolic holy world that is depicted in this manuscript illumination, which is very different in its style from the classical artists whose work was much more sensual, much more earthy. This is much more unworldly, geometric, because geometry was felt to be very pure and divine. Well, in the Renaissance, artists' attitude about the world changed again. And they looked around at the world and they saw that, in fact, there was order in the world. It wasn't just chaos. And that not only was there an order in the world, but there was a geometrically precise order in the world that they could capture with a system called linear perspective, which allowed them to depict three-dimensional spaces in a very accurate way. And so here in this painting, or this engraving by Albrecht Dürer, during the Renaissance, I think this is 1517, he is depicting St. Jerome in his study, but notice the windows, notice the ceiling, notice how accurate he is using that perspective system to give us the illusion of a three-dimensional space, a very convincing, realistic three-dimensional space. The image is still very idealized. It is a saint in his study. It's a holy moment. And there is the lion, that was a symbol of St. Jerome, lying next to the dog, implying that in this rational world there would be peace and harmony. And at that time, there was a philosopher by the name of René Descartes, who's famous for the statement, "I think, therefore I am." And what he meant by that was that because I have reason, I can perceive who I am and my place in the world, and I can reasonably apprehend the world around me. And so this reason that I am born with, and he felt that we were born with it. We were born with this little piece of God inside our minds, which allowed us to make sense of the world around us in a very rational way. And so if God was reason, then when we were most in harmony with God, with the divine world, we were most reasonable, most rational. And we can see another depiction of that system of linear perspective, that style of Renaissance art, in this drawing by Leonardo da Vinci, which was in preparation for one of his paintings. But notice how the lines are creating this very convincing three-dimensional space. And notice that roof. We're going to see that in one of our later pictures, something similar. So here, this is a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci depicting the perspective system, this very rational system, which told us, implied by its artistic style, that the world was a good place, a place of order, of harmony. Not only was there an order, but it was a geometrically precise mathematical order. Well, a little later, artists said, that may be how you see the world, but that's not the world I live in. The world I live in is much more down to earth, much more earthy, much more realistic. And so here we have this painting by David 10 years the younger of a tavern scene. Here is a very down-to-earth style, a very earthy, matter-of-fact style. And instead of seeing a saint writing or reading scripture, we have people that are drinking and smoking. Not only are they not doing something holy, they're probably doing something that's fairly sinful. And but the artist said, hey, that's the world I live in. And so the style that I'm going to work in is one that reflects the world that I live in and how I see that world around me. And at that time, there was another philosopher by the name of David Hume, and he was an empiricist. Now, René Descartes was a rationalist because he believed in reason. David Hume was an empiricist because he said, no, what you see is what you get. And if we develop any sense of reason or any rational perspectives, it's because of our interaction with the world. So if I kick a ball and it moves, then I learn about cause and effect. And so it is when I come into the David Hume and the empiricists felt that when I was born, when I came into the world, I came in as a blank slate. And that everything I know, all of my perceptions, all of my ability to make sense of the world is based on my experiences, what I see, and how I interact with the world. And that is imprinted on my mind, and not because of some divine spark or element in my head ahead of time. A little later after that, there was a philosopher by the name of Emanuel Kant who said, who examined the rationalists and the empiricists, and he said, they're both wrong and they're both right. They both have a piece of it, but I think we need to combine those two together. And so he felt that we had to be born with some, what he called a priori knowledge, that allowed us to make sense of the chaos, the visual chaos around us, but that it really didn't come into play until we interacted with the real world. And so it was that combination of the a priori knowledge and our interaction with the real world that allowed us to perceive the world and make sense of the world that we saw. And so the artists of the time embodied that point of view. And so here is this painting by Jacques-Louis David. Now notice, it's a painting from history, of Roman history. And notice that it is, on one hand, very rational. The painting has been divided by these arches into these three separate regions, these three separate zones. And on the left are the young men, and over on the right are the women as part of this drama, and then in the middle is the father who's administering this oath. And so it is sort of a very sort of rational painting, developed very rationally, but notice that the details are very realistic. And so it's a combination of realistic observation and rational conception that creates this style. This is called neoclassic style, neoclassicism. And so this style was a combination of the rational and the observational that made for what the artists felt was a more truthful, more complete version of reality than what had gone before. Well, here in the 20th century, one of the major events of the early 20th century was World War I. And that created all sorts of chaos and confusion and destruction. I mean, millions of people were killed. Cities were destroyed. And, there was this, from the Middle Ages onward, there was this aristocratic culture in Europe, in the Western world. And, it was started with God in heaven, and then there were the saints, and then there were the angels, and then there were the kings and queens, and then the dukes and earls, and then the bishops and the priests, and then, the priests are the commoners and the peasants. And so you had this divine order that started from God and extended all the way down to the peasantry, and that was the structure of European society for centuries. Well, that was all destroyed during World War I. In fact, the Russian Revolution destroyed one of the major aristocracies in Europe. But many aristocracies ended during this period. And so artists saw themselves as individuals, and they were going to develop individual styles. And because of the invention of the camera, they didn't have to make pictures of the world anymore. They could create art that would be expressing their own ideas, their own attitudes of what was real and what was important and what wasn't. And so here we have in this portrait by Modigliani an image that looks much more like what we saw in the Middle Ages. Notice how the figure is much more symbolic, much more geometric, and it is not as worldly as the artists of the Renaissance or the Baroque period or the Neoclassic period. So, here in this modern era, artists are looking at the world and treating it more symbolically because they felt that was more real, more honest, more truthful. And here's another artist by the name of George Tooker, an American artist, who's painting in 1950. And here he's using that perspective system. But he's using perspective, using reason to show how isolated and lonely people were. And that's what Karl Marx said. Karl Marx said that we were, isolated from the means of production, and that's why we needed this communist revolution. And, so here we have an artist depicting that sense of isolation, using this very rational perspective to create that image. Friedrich Nietzsche said, God is dead. And so artists, why should I paint a picture of anything? Because that implies some further meaning. There is no further meaning beyond my painting, beyond, I look at the world around me. The world is what it is. It's just the stuff of the world. And my artwork is just going to be the stuff of art. It's going to be lines and colors and shapes, and that's it. Artists created an abstract style or a non-objective style of painting, which wasn't a picture of anything. It was just using the stuff of art, in this case perspective, and colors and shapes and paint to create an image that was beautiful, was interesting, but wasn't a picture of anything. Now, other artists said, no. If we're going to paint anything, let's go and look at what we see, the real world around us. And we're not going to pretty it up. We're just going to go outside and paint whatever we see, and what we see is what you get. And so here we have Claude Monet in the 1870s taking his easel all over the place, and here he's taking it into a train station and just painting the train station. Why the train stations aren't very pretty? Well, so what? That's the real world. I'm going to paint the real world that's around me. And so here he is painting the interior of that train station, and the Impressionist style, and that's what this was. This was the Impressionist style. The Impressionists felt that, we didn't look at and stare at our subjects. We looked around, we glanced around, and we got impressions of things. And so when they painted, they wanted to create that sort of impressionist way of viewing the world. So in this painting, he's trying to give us just a very fresh, spontaneous view of the life around him. But is it really? Is it really so fresh and spontaneous and unplanned? Notice how symmetrical it is. See that roof line? Notice how it creates this symmetry in the composition, like we saw in that Leonardo da Vinci drawing. Also notice that he's repeating the shapes of the roof of the train station in the light and shadow pattern on the ground. And so maybe this isn't quite so spontaneous and quite so unplanned as he would like us to believe. Maybe this is a little more engineered, a little more carefully coordinated. 100 years later, the artist Richard Estes, working in a photorealist style, tried to create images that they felt were more honest and more truthful. And the photorealists felt that, our own individual perceptions are distorted and they're very human. And if we want something that's accurate, an accurate view of the world, then, we have to rely on a machine that helps us to create this very accurate, matter-of-fact view of the world, the camera. And so we're going to take pictures, and instead of painting that world, we're going to paint the picture that we have taken with the camera, because that's really truthful. That's really accurate. And our paintings should be honest and accurate and truthful. So they created what we now know as the photorealist style, which they felt was, just very matter-of-fact, snapshotty, and, just spontaneous. But really, is this picture really that spontaneous? Notice, here we're in this bus, and we're looking out the window, and we're in Midtown Manhattan. But when Estes was painting this picture, he used two different photographs. There was a photograph out the window, those people walking on the sidewalk and those buildings, that's one photograph. And then the people inside the bus, that's another photograph. He was famous for collaging photographs together that he would then paint from. And so this image, which seems really spontaneous and very realistic, may actually be very much planned and isn't very spontaneous at all. But that was the photorealist style. It was an art style that was felt to be a more accurate and truthful depiction of the world around at that time. Now, another development in the 20th century was psychology. Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, who felt that the subconscious mind influenced our perceptions as much as anything else. And so here in this painting by Giorgio de Chirico, we have the artist trying to combine the way we see the world with the way we feel about the world, how we respond on a subconscious level. And he's creating an image that is, very much derived from the world, but it also seems very much derived from dreams. It seems very sort of distorted and dreamlike. And Surrealist, and this was the Surrealist style. The Surrealist style was based on the premise that we could combine what we saw and how we felt about what we saw, how we responded subconsciously to what we saw, how we dreamt about what we saw. And we can see that in this painting by de Chirico. Here's another painting by René Magritte. And here, another Surrealist painting. Again, a combination of the visual world with the subconscious world, with how we feel about the world. And these Surrealist paintings can seem kind of strange to us, but they felt they were very honest. They were a very honest depiction, a very truthful depiction of how we actually experience life. And then we had other artists who said, well, no, I have visions, and my visions are what's real. And so I'm going to create these paintings which are very visionary, that depict the visions that I have. And so here we have this painting by Henri Rousseau, and called The Dream. And, it seems like this nude woman in a jungle landscape. But Henri Rousseau never went to the jungle. All those plants that he's painted in his picture, those are based on house plants and plants that he saw in the botanical garden. And so, yes, he's recreating his dream, his vision, but it's also, he had to do some research too to create this painting. He's creating a painting in this visionary style. And here's one of my paintings. This one's called Wild Dogs. It's about 6 feet high by 4 feet wide. And I painted it in 1982. And I felt that it was sort of a fairly honest description of the life around me. And even though people might seem to be interacting in a very polite and dignified and civilized way, it was actually a much more dog-eat-dog world than people were willing to admit. And so here, this is my vision of the world, my vision of truth, of the way the world really was at that time. And this painting is now in the permanent collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And then we have other artists who feel that, well, no, actually, you artists sitting in your ivory towers coming up with your different styles, that's not very realistic at all. A realistic style is one that's developed in collaboration with others, in collaboration with the business world. Artists need to get paid, and so we want to be part of the real world, and so our art is going to be real art for real people in the real world. And here we have this painting by Vargas, which, a pinup girl. But he would say, hey, that's what people want to see, and that's what I'm going to paint. And so my art is not just something coming out of my head. It's an interaction between me and my clients and my viewers. And that creates a much more, in a sense, truthful, honest art than what you would have if just the artist were sitting there dreaming up things in his own studio. Another artist working as an illustrator was Norman Rockwell. And he painted this for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. It's a triple self-portrait. I think it's one of the most significant paintings of the 20th century, because here we have Norman Rockwell maybe seeing the way the world sees him, his back to us as he's working at his easel, and there he is looking at himself in the mirror, so there's another representation of him seeing himself in the mirror, and then we have the picture of him on the canvas, which seems much more idealized. He's younger. And so we have these three different views of Norman Rockwell, giving us kind of like a more complete picture of who he really was, because he was the person. He was the image in the mirror, and he was the image on the canvas, because that's how he sees himself. And so this is a much more complex painting than we might at first think. But again, he would have felt that it was a very honest, very truthful depiction of reality, which resulted from the interaction of the artist with the client, with the publisher, with the magazine editor. And then we have other artists who work in different genres: wildlife artists, waterfowl artists, artists who paint cowboys, artists who paint fishing scenes. And they say, no, our pictures are what people really want to look at. And so they are, in a sense, much more honest, much more truthful, because that's what people really want to look at. And we are interacting with the public. And so we're giving the public what they want to see, which is an art that is more about, what people really want in their lives. Well, how does style develop? Are there any examples where we could see how a style develops? Because we can have this illusion that, styles are like, something that you pick out, like going into a car lot and, you pick out a car and that's your car. Is that the way it is with styles, with art styles? Well, in some cases it is. I mean, we can do that. We can paint we can imitate other artists. We can start off painting like someone else. But since we're not them and we're not living in the time that they're living in, if we keep painting that way, after a while, our style is going to evolve. It's going to become much more personal, much more our own. And so this whole idea that a style evolves over time, I think is an important one. So let's look at this painting by Piet Mondrian. And this was done in 1929. This is classic abstract art from the early 20th century. But how did it develop? Well, here we see Mondrian painting a picture of a tree, and this is done about 20 years earlier. And notice how he's emphasizing the curves, the lines of the tree, the shapes of the tree, and he's painting it in sort of a post-impressionist style. And then a little later on, he starts to emphasize the curves of the tree, the shapes of the tree, and not so much the textures or anything else or the colors. He's just looking at the shapes and the lines of the tree and emphasizing that because that's what he feels is most important. And then a little later on after that, notice how he's reduced the tree. And this painting is still titled The Apple Tree in Flower, the flowering apple tree. And notice how he's reduced it to just lines and shapes and colors. And it's really removed from the source. He's not really painting a picture of the tree anymore. He's creating a painting based on those tree shapes which he has observed. And then after that, and what's interesting about this, notice that those lines at the top suggest the tree trunk. And it's almost like this painting is upside down. And then after that, Mondrian created a painting which he just titled Composition, which is just lines and shapes and colors, which is, because we've looked at those previous pictures, we can see was derived from the tree drawings and paintings, but it's really removed from that. It's become just a painting about lines and shapes and colors. And it's very much removed. It's really not a picture of a tree anymore. It's just an abstract composition. Or it is an abstract composition, not just an abstract composition. And then after that, he developed this very abstract, very non-objective style of painting, which is just about color and shape and balance and lines. It's not a picture of anything anymore. It's a painting of itself, on its own, in an abstract style. Now, we can see that Mondrian sort of abstracted his painting, his style, from those tree paintings. There were other artists who looked at this work and said, it's a beautiful painting, but, that's not how I see my life. I'm much more confused and much more emotional, and the paint that I'm using is more drippy and spontaneous. And so those artists developed an expressionist style of abstraction. And here in this painting by Jackson Pollock, we can see what would become called abstract expressionism. We can see Jackson Pollock applying the paint in a very expressive manner, dripping the paint, throwing the paint onto the canvas in a way that's very, very different from the very formal abstract style of Piet Mondrian. Well, thank you for letting me talk to you about style and how style evolves. And you're going to notice that style often evolves over years, over months, years, even decades. And we may start off painting one way. We may start off painting realistically, and then paint abstractly or paint in a surrealist manner. And then as we continue to work, the painting style becomes more and more our own, more an expression of who we are and the time that we're living in. And it doesn't just evolve for the artist, it also evolves for the art lover and the art collector, because they will find themselves looking at certain styles of art, looking at certain types of art, collecting certain types of art. And if you are an artist and you want to develop your own style of art, then you'll find yourself beginning to paint in a more and more individualized way as time passes, as you make more and more paintings. But it often doesn't begin that way. It often begins with us being influenced by an artist, us even actually imitating another artist, but then over time, gradually becoming more and more ourselves. If you wouldn't mind, leave a comment. I read all the comments, and like the video, subscribe, and that helps me to make more of these videos in the future.